Hi guys, welcome back to History 109. Thank you for your patience with me trying to get through my technological issues this semester so far. I know that there have been a couple things so far. I'm hoping to work out all of those kinks though, so hopefully all goes well from here on out. So for tonight, I wanted to show you a couple of cool things. I've got some neat pieces here with me that I'm going to show to you as we go through the lecture this evening. So tonight we're going to be covering Reconstruction through the 20th century. So we're going to cover things like photographs and different pieces of popular culture and different pieces that will go along with clothing and art and fashion. And I'll explain to you guys what these things are as we go along. And there's just some really neat stuff here. So hopefully you guys will enjoy these as much as I do because I think they're fabulous. And I think my favorite pieces are the ladies' collections of ivory pieces. And I'll kind of explain to you what these pieces are used for as we go along, like I said. So pretty kind of cool stuff. But now let's go ahead and get on with the rest of this, and we'll come back to these in just a few minutes. So first and foremost, we need to talk about westward expansion. So westward expansion is built on this idea of manifest destiny. And we know that in about 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was made under Jefferson for about $15 million. But by 1840 or so, you have 7 million people that are starting westward on the Oregon Trail. And this was used less once the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in about 1869. Now we've finished by this point with slavery. Slavery is no more, but we still have a need for labor as we move westward. So that most of the cheap labor, instead of coming from slaves, are going to come from Chinese immigration. You'll still have some African Americans who are working in not so great conditions, but they are at least free and have rights. Chinese immigrants do not. So this idea of westward expansion is further justified by the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848. There's a territorial dispute, and I believe we talked a little bit about this last time, but just going into this again, so there's a border dispute over whether the United States, its border, is on the Rio Grande, where it is today, or the Nueces, which the Mexican government believed that that's where it was. And then from there over to California. Later, the Gadsden Purchase would add what is a lower portion of what today is New Mexico and Arizona in about 1853. And you guys can see on your little map of the United States here, you've got all of the territory that was originally part of what we'll call the Eastern United States prior to the Civil War. So it's all in brown. And then you've got the Louisiana Purchase that goes up in white. You've got the territory that's annexed in Texas and all of that territory in blue. And then from there, that goes all the way over to California. Now, just below that, well, that portion goes over in pink. Now, in like a pinky orange, right below that, that is the Gadsden Purchase. And then above that, you've got the Oregon Territory that only Native Americans have claim to at this point. Some French explorers were thought to have gone that far west, but they've not claimed any of that property. They're solely trapping, hunting, that kind of stuff, and there aren't many of those. But like I said, there's more of this movement westward at this part. Now, the Gadsden Purchase was done solely in order to build the lower portion of the Transcontinental Railroad going over to California. Now, under the Homestead Acts, homesteaders, or people who were using government land, they were farming on government land that they were given in order to create established populations inside these territories, gave homesteaders land. So usually about 160 acres were given under the Homestead Act. And this is at no cost beyond a small filing fee, and approximately 270 million acres are given away to approximately 160 or so homesteaders. Now, in 1862, the 1862 Act was eligible to any adult who had never taken up arms against the United States. So now this is solely for those who have not entered into the Civil War. But in 1866, the act was geared toward African Americans, but racism really curbed the influx of African Americans into these territories. You know, some people believe that it's because about a fourth of all Southern black farmers um, owned farms in the South. I don't necessarily think that that's the real reason. I think most of it is because of racism as you move into these territories. So you still have, you know, these large landholding Caucasian males who are in the South. And as you're moving over into the areas that would become the Louisiana Purchase, these areas are very big into sugar cane and the making of molasses and the making of alcohol from molasses. So you're still seeing the same kind of hierarchical establishment in the South. And so having the African Americans move into those territories, they're still being set up in that same kind of system. So it doesn't really help to kind of break that class structure. But the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, it attempts to balance wealth discrepancies between the social classes in the South by selling land at very low prices. But like I said, efforts of the racist elite keeps it from being overly effective during Reconstruction. Now, about that same time, you have the gold rush in the Klondike and in California, and this also starts pushing for westward expansion. And the gold rush will last from approximately 1845 to about 1855. Most most people who went and panned for gold and were part of the gold rush started from Skagway and then would move into Canada through the Klondike, through the White Pass Trail. And this is founded by William Moore. It's also known as the Chilkoot Trail. Now, I've seen this trail before, and it is treacherous. There is this giant gaping ledge that is very, very steep. And I want to say that they called that area that was down in the bottom of that, like the like Horsebone Gulch or something along those lines, because what would happen is as you were taking people up through that pass and you were taking provisions up through that pass, your horses were falling over the edge and dying. So, you know, that's kind of like littered with animal bones down in the bottom of that. It's an extremely treacherous area. Not only is it just bitterly cold in the winter, but even in the summer, it's not great. And in fact, in the winter, it gets so cold that it's a barren wasteland, and the winds are just absolutely ferocious. We saw areas where it routinely gets like below -50 degrees. It's absolutely miraculous that anybody was able to survive this at all. In the area that we went to, it's so barren in places that there's actually even a desert. The world's smallest desert is in the Klondike, which is where these folks were going to get gold. Now, many times, there were, how to put this, Canadian officials would just kind of hang out on that border at the top of this pass. And as they were there, they were kind of monitoring who was going into Canada because there were so many people who were dying because they were running out of provisions. So Canadian officials started requiring at least 1 year's worth of provisions before they were allowed to cross the border. And this is approximately 1,000 pounds. Most people can't afford 1,000 pounds worth of provisions for 1 year. So this deterred a lot of people coming into those areas. But at the same time, people were still getting through. And eventually, you'll have a train that will ferry passengers up to the top of this pass. And you can see in the picture here, it's the black and white picture, and it's all covered in snow. You can see some people in it in a little town below. That little town is Skagway. And on the left-hand side, that's the pass that they would go up. And then on the right-hand side, that is the side that they eventually would put the train on going up that. Now, you can see here, there's a little black line that goes straight up the side of that gorge there. And that line is actually a trolley system that was built quite a bit later. But initially, they were going just straight up that hillside there, or they were going kind of around the pass there to try to get around that pass in order to get into the Klondike. So instead of going straight up the hill, they're kind of taking a little roundabout. But the train doesn't come in for many, many years still. So there's still issues with getting supplies up into the Klondike. But, you know, and like I said, the conditions there are quite treacherous. More people died than found gold. Many, many people went completely bankrupt, or, you know, died of starvation, or died of cold, you know, extreme weather conditions, especially in the Klondike. Very few people actually struck it rich by going and panning for gold. There was just enough people who made it into those areas and were able to find large quantities of gold, and the media was really starting to really play into this a whole lot. So there were just enough people that it really became a prominent thing. It's seen as like something that could potentially happen. That, you know, this really became like the fad for the time. Now, the whole time we're moving westward, we're seeing a continual trend of pushing Native Americans westward. And this really begins from the time that the British brought their first colony over. We're pushing westward. But it stops briefly. And then about 1812-ish, we start seeing a movement westward again, from beyond the Mississippi. You've got to think of this in the scope that many of the Native Americans have already died due to illness. They've already died, you know, trying to fight these battles. They've already been pushed westward. And then it's compounded when they're moved even farther west, out of places that they know how to survive in, because the U.S. government isn't going to give them any kind of benefits when they enter these reserves. They're just kind of pushed into this territory and said, you're stuck here, don't move or we'll kill you. And they're trying to fend for themselves in this land that they have no idea how to survive in. And it's not exactly fantastic land either. So we really see this movement west of the Mississippi beginning, especially um, for the Cherokee. We see this starting with the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which is signed by Andrew Jackson, and it pushes them west of the Mississippi, mostly over into Oklahoma. And this event is known, generally speaking, as the Trail of Tears. And the most notable conflicts in these areas occur between the Civil War and in the 1890s. These conflicts generally took place near the Mexican border, with Arizona having the highest number of Native American attacks and Native American battles, or the U.S. Army going in and doing something to Native Americans in those areas. It's kind of the full culmination. But there are 310 known battles, and they're all recorded by the U.S. Army. So you have to take what they're saying with a grain of salt. You know, granted, we today look to our government to be completely honest. That's not necessarily what's going on at this point in history. Their records are scant at best, and not only are they scant, but there's still this idea of you've got to make yourself look really good, so you're kind of going to embellish things a little bit. But these conflicts are part of a contributing factors for the tensions between the Plains Indians and the U.S. Army. So around let me think. It's around April of 1868 at Fort Laramie. You have the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty, which is supposed to keep honor and peace with the Native Americans, reimburse them for any lost property, and what is supposed to happen is that no one is supposed to be given any kind of Sioux property without consent. And it has to be 3/4 majority consent. But the Sioux retain the right to hunt, at least in the Bighorn Mountains. And if any of you guys have been out west, the Bighorn Mountains have quite a bit of wildlife there. They have pronghorn, they have some buffalo, deer, and this is what's there today. Now, before most of the herds of buffalo were destroyed, you have buffalo everywhere. They're like seas of buffalo. But with the movement westward, and as Caucasian and European men move westward, most of those populations are completely depleted. In fact, at one point, we had to put buffalo on like the endangered species list to try to keep them from disappearing completely forever. But this is seen as an attempt to keep peaceable relations with the Native Americans. But it's completely a lie. It's completely a lie. And in fact, you have between the Lakota, the Sioux, and the Northern Cheyenne, they are involved in what's known as the Great Sioux War of 1876 with the U.S. government. So what's going on here is that the U.S. government wants the Black Hills. They want the Black Hills because the Black Hills in South Dakota are full of gold. Gold, 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 gold. And a lot of silver and turquoise too, but gold. So with the Black Hills Act, they will confiscate 7.3 million acres of Black Hills land in exchange for what they consider aid necessary for civilization. They don't define what that is. And in fact, evidence shows that they never meant to give any kind of aid whatsoever. I mean, they gave out some few rations, not enough to sustain a population. But there's practically no food going around. People are starving, and they're taking it without consent. And so from here, we'll move on to see more and more issues going on between, especially the Sioux, and the U.S. government. And you'll see most of what people consider to be the greatest atrocities that the U.S. government has committed against Native Americans in U.S. history. So you'll have the Battle of the Little Bighorn with Custer's Last Stand, the iconic charge in June of 1876. And this is where Custer with the 12th Regiment will attempt to take on the Lakota, the Arapaho, and the Northern Cheyenne. Having been to this place too, you essentially have about 3 rolling hills. And this is where the national park is today, but you'll have like 3 rolling hills, and then you've got the Lakota and the Arapaho, who are supposed to come in and surround Custer and defeat him in battle. There's a graveyard there. There's a couple monuments there, but other than that, it's just a giant field. When you go out there, it's not particularly impressive, in my opinion. But some people are into that. So if you ever get the chance to go out west, you should absolutely stop by and see it. When we were out there, we ended up just kind of hanging out for 20 minutes. You know, the national park had closed for the evening, so we didn't get to go very far into the area. And it's essentially just a big field. There's some pronghorn there. That's about it. But moving on with this. So from this point with the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the U.S. government will attempt to sell or starve what they want. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Is they want either the Native Americans to sell the land or starve to death, because, like I said, they're holding them kind of captive inside these reservations. So in June of 1876, Congress will cut off all rations to the reserves until the wanted land was sold to the U.S. government. And you can see a picture of the Sioux Reservation here, and you can see the areas that the U.S. government is wanting to take over. It's a huge, huge portion of land, and you know, eventually the U.S. will take that land, but at that time they're attempting to either get them to sell it or starve them out. So with the passage of the agreement of 1877, what we consider as historians to be vast devastation of Native American encampments and property just goes through the roof. So the U.S. government will annex all of the Sioux territory that they can get their hands on, and so they kind of end that the sell or starve and just say we're going to take it. And with the agreement of 1877, in 1888, the government will issue beef herds be sent to the Sioux Reservation, but they almost entirely die of anthrax before they get there, and they start affecting the buffalo too. So it's these rations that they're sending, they're no good. They don't make it. Half the time they die, and the other half of the time there's not enough to go around. Well, about this time, in 1889, you'll have a figure called Wovoka, who will introduce something called the ghost dance. Now, Wovoka was originally known as Jack Wilson. He was an fully assimilated Native American who had gone into Caucasian society and was attempting to pass as a Caucasian, essentially. But he'll have these mystic visions, and he'll say that if they do what he wants, which is a song and a dance ritual. And they return back to their Native American ways, then they can have the buffalo come back, and the deceased Native American brethren will come back to life, and they'll drive out the white man and, regain their land. But it's this really elaborate song and dance, and you can see videos of it, which is really cool. I actually think one of them is down here at the bottom of this slide. So make sure that you guys watch these videos because they're pretty freaking cool. But the ghost dance will be taught to the Sioux. It'll spread to the Sioux between 1889 and 1890. And then around 1890, you'll have Clark Hyde, who will be told by a native from the Pierre Indian School in Pierre, South Dakota, that they're getting ready to do this ghost dance. It's solely a dance. There's no arms involved. There's no threatening behavior. They're just dancing collectively and singing. That's really all there is to it. But he'll write to the Secretary of the Interior and will claim that this is an act of aggression on the part of the Sioux. So in November of 1890, the Rapid City Journal will report that the Sioux are on the warpath. And that's not really what was going on at all. In December of that same year, Sitting Bull will be arrested and murdered by the federal Indian police at Standing Rock Reservation. And you can see Standing Rock Reservation. It should be up towards the top. Yes, so it's on the border of North Dakota and South Dakota. So it's all the way at the top. If you look at your picture here, it's the dark orange area. It has a lighter section, and it's straddling the line between North and South Dakota, is where this reservation is. But you'll have increased tensions from here on out, and then it'll finally come to a head between December 28th of 1890 and January 3rd, 1891, where you'll have tensions increase to the point where there will be a massacre at Wounded Knee Creek. And the Native Americans who are staying there at that point, they'll be all brutally murdered, and their bodies will be left frozen in the snow for days. And then once the snow thaws out and the ground thaws out, they'll be buried in a mass grave. The only thing that we have to commemorate this is this one picture that's down here in the bottom right hand corner. It's a very small monument to those who died at Wounded Knee Creek. And you can see around the fence there, you can see those ribbons that are tied on to the fence there. And those are Native American prayer ribbons, from my understanding. And you'll see these all over the most of the monuments, most of the places that were considered sacred to the Native Americans and their culture. You'll see these ribbons tied in trees and tied on fences, tied on anything that they can hang on. And I personally don't know what exactly they're for. I'd be really interested to see what you guys can turn up with this. But I know that I saw them not only in this picture, but they are also around Devil's Tower. You can find them in the scrub brush and practically everything in South Dakota, all the way west, and you'll see them. I want to say that I even saw them in Yellowstone while we were there. But this is a highly spiritual area for Native Americans. So with this, I really encourage you guys to watch these videos. I'm almost positive that one of them is taken from the standpoint of the Native Americans and what they saw, and what their family members experienced from this. And the other one, I believe, is a video of the ghost dance, if I'm not mistaken. But they're both really valuable videos, so please, I encourage you to watch those. So moving on from here, this period of Reconstruction is just horribly, vilely violent. And it's not only out west that we're seeing these issues. They're in our own backyard. So with this, I wanted to talk to you guys for just a little bit about some of the other disputes that are going on at this time. Now, I am absolutely positive that most everyone has at least heard of the Hatfield-McCoy feuds. If you haven't, I am absolutely just flabbergasted. But the Hatfield and McCoy feuds are kind of iconic of what's going on in America at this point. So you've got just vast numbers of people who are just killing each other, and it's all over the United States at this point. So we'll look just solely at the Hatfield and the McCoy feud. There's also the Breathitt County feuds, where supposedly, there's even bloodier massacre between these two feuding families. You've got the first governor shortly, I believe it's actually during this time, yeah. So right at the turn of the century, you'll have the first governor, and I believe the only governor, to ever be assassinated, and it happens in Kentucky. You still have issues between, north and south, as you'll see with this. There are still these bloody conflicts that are kind of going on, despite the fact that the war is over, and despite the fact that, things belong to other people. We're going to just say, forget it, we'll just kill you. So this is an incredibly bloody time, okay? It's not a time anybody wants to live in. But there is a ray of hope, so progress will come. But with this specifically, the Hatfield and McCoy feuds will happen on the West Virginia and Kentucky border. And you can see in the area on this map that I've included here, everything that's in dark green is the area that is afflicted by these feuds. And now with these, there are many, many names of people who are interrelated, and it gets a little confusing. So just try to keep up. Most of this will not end up on your test, so I wouldn't worry about it too badly. Get a couple of key names and, know where it's at. That's about it. So in both families will have members that support the Confederacy. There's only one person in the family who's known as, and please forgive me if I butcher these names, Asa Harmon McCoy, and he will fight for the Union. Now, Asa was shot in the chest during the war. But he comes home. He survives and he comes home despite all odds. And he'll be killed by the Logan Wildcats, which is likely led by Jim Vance, who was the uncle of William Anderson, or Devil Anse Hatfield. And he'll be killed on January 7th, 1865. So 13 days after his final day of service. He'll be home for 13 days, or out of the army for 13 days, and he'll be killed. Most people consider this feud to really come to a head, though, with a dispute over a pig. So this hog the dispute is between Floyd Hatfield and Randolph McCoy. And how they would mark their animals is rather than branding them, like you might do a cow or something like that, you'll notch the ears. So you'll essentially take your knife on your piglet and you'll just kind of make cuts in the pig's ear, and hope that they heal well enough that they're still recognizable. Well, both sides said that the pig had their ear notches. Um, to this day, I don't think anyone knows exactly what these two groups, their notches on their pig's ears were supposed to look like. But regardless, in 1878, they start fighting over this, and the justice of the peace here, who's named Anderson or Preacher Ants Hatfield, will declare that the hog belongs to the Hatfields, based on the testimony of a mutual family member between both groups, so both the Hatfields and the McCoys, um, named Bill Staton. He will later be killed by two of the McCoy brothers. Now, I want to make something clear before we go on to from here. The majority of the time, the conflicts will take place between the Hatfields and the McCoys in court. They just occasionally get out of hand. So from here, you see this explosion of violence between them, these two groups. So you'll have a love affair between Rosanna McCoy and Johnson or Johnsy Hatfield, who is Devil Ance's son. She'll leave the McCoys and then later will return to them. And what will happen is that she'll become pregnant, and Devil Ance, his son, Johnsy, will leave her, and so she'll return back to her family. They will attempt to resume the relationship at some point, but Johnsy will be arrested by the McCoys on bootlegging warrants. And so they won't ever actually return to resume this relationship. And so what will happen is Devil Ance will mount a posse and ride after the McCoys, and try to rescue his son from being arrested. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to get to him before he reaches Pikeville, which is where the local county seat will be. And they will be the ones who judge whether or not he should actually have been arrested, and where they'll hold him and try him at Pikeville. Now, like I said, at this point, Rosanna is pregnant, and the relationship will never be what it once was. In fact, what will happen is we'll see Johnsy leave her for Nancy McCoy, who is her cousin, and they'll be married in 1881. Now in 82, very shortly thereafter, you'll have Ellison Hatfield, who is Devil Ance's brother, be killed by Rosanna's younger brothers. So Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud are their names. And they'll fight with Ellison. Ellison's drunk at the time. Devil Ance is there. It's election day. You know, spirits are high, of course. But these brothers will stab Ellison 26 times, and then they'll shoot him once. And they're arrested, but while they're in transit to Pikeville, same scenario as with Johnsy, they will be captured by the Hatfields. They'll intercede with them, and they'll take them back to West Virginia. Ellison survives the initial attack, but will eventually die from his wounds. So the boys will be led out, and they'll be tied to pawpaw bushes, and they'll be shot 50 times between the two of them. And of course, they die. But all of those who were involved in the killing will be indicted, but many of them will not be captured after this point. So with the help from Percy Klein, who ended up losing about a 1,000-acre lawsuit to Devil Ants. He's also married to Martha McCoy, so you've got that family tension there too. He will ask that all of them be indicted, and he'll send out people to go out and capture them. So in 1886, Jeff McCoy will be killed by Fred Wolford. The constable, Cap Hatfield, went to go capture Jeff McCoy, and he and Tom Wallace will shoot him on the Tug River. Wallace will later be found dead in spring of 87. So you've kind of got this tit for tat, back and forth kind of thing going on. Well, in 1888, we see that these two families, the tension will leave after the beginning of 1888 because practically everyone will be dead or just unable to keep up this level of feud. So on New Year's Eve in spring of 1888, on New Year's Day night of 1888, we'll see the New Year's Night Massacre, where you'll have Cap Hatfield and Jim Vance. They'll be surrounded, and the posse who was sent out to collect them by Perry Klein will fire on them, and they will burn the home of the McCoys in an attempt to capture Randolph McCoy and his family while he sleeps. Randolph McCoy will escape, but two of his children are captured, two of his children are shot and his wife is beaten, and then another child got frostbite, and they'll eventually move to Pikeville, so they'll just kind of move out of the area. From there, you'll have Frank Phillips, who is the county deputy sheriff, who will ride out to capture Devil Ants and the rest of his group in West Virginia. Jim Vance will be killed at this point because he refused to be arrested. You'll have a raid on Hatfield homes. They'll capture 3 people before the Battle of the Grapevine Creek, which will happen in January of 88. And then Phillips will meet kind of this armed group of men, and the Phillipses will battle out, this bloody, horrible mess on the side of this creek, where 2 Hatfield supporters will be killed. And then you'll also have a deputy named Bill Dempsey, who will be executed by Phipps after the surrender. To me, it's not clear why Bill Dempsey was killed. I don't know, but I'd be interested to see if you guys find anything out. This really is not my area of expertise, so I would be very interested to hear why. Let's see. Anyways, Valentine or Wall Hatfield and 8 others will be brought to Kentucky to stand trial for the murder of Aflair McCoy, who was Randolph's daughter, and she was one of the children who were shot. And 7 will receive life imprisonment. Only 1 will be hanged, and his name is Ellison Cottentop Mounts. And then later, Johnsey will be tried in 1901, and I believe that he ends up being hanged too, but it's not until much, much later. So now, with all this death and destruction, we get to move on to a silver lining. So let's talk about, or we'll call it a semi-silver lining, and we'll kind of go on from there. So not only is this period well known for its bloody engagements, but it will also be known for its changes in the way that money is working at the time. So they will get the name the Gilded Age, which runs parallel to Reconstruction. Remember I talked about last time, we talked about Reconstruction and then like overlapping trends. This is one of those overlapping trends. So the Gilded Age is known as the period between 1870 and 1900. So we're crossing over the same timeline, but keep them separate in your brain, okay? This term will come from Mark Twain's novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The majority of the age is marked by rapid economic growth with intermittent panics. And we kind of talked about panics last time and how when you're putting a lot of money in and then you take a lot of money out, all of a sudden you have a depression or in this case, they're panics. So they're shorter than depressions. They're smaller than depressions. They're not quite as deep cutting. They end up being a lot like the recession that we saw a few years ago. However, what's really different about this is that there's no insurance, nothing to protect your money from, in the case of a panic. So, hello, Oscar. My cat has returned. So when you see this picture that's down in the bottom left-hand corner, this is a bank panic. And what you'll have here is you'll have groups of men or women or anybody who can get their hands on the money, and they'll start trying to fight their way into the bank. And whoever ends up inside the bank first to get their money, which is at this point backed by gold, so they're trying to get gold or precious metals of some kind, they'll try to get as much of that out as they can before the bank runs out of money and they run out of gold, because you'll have cash in hand and no backing for it. So they're essentially depleting the economy of its backing, which is gold. So you'll have, and once they run out of that, there's no more. You can't get more. You can't just up and get more gold. So those who have their money in the bank, when the bank runs out of money, they've lost their life savings. The bank goes under, the bank closes, and it's like, well, sorry, you don't have any money. Your whole life savings is gone. So that's why these people look so harried trying to get into these banks. Now, a lot of these banks and their bank failures and their intermittent panics at this time, goodbye Oscar, are spurred on by issues in Argentina. Most notably, in 1893. This one will be directly related to Argentina because there will be a giant Argentine bank failure because of crop failure, specifically wheat, and a coup d'etat where the U.S. Bank is like, the U.S. is trying to support foreign investors and their banks in Argentina, and when those banks fail, it'll affect the U.S. economy. We'll see many wage increases for skilled workers, but an influx of immigrants. So you'll have a lot of these lower class women, especially, who will be coming in and working textile mills and things like that. And they'll be the lowest dregs of society in the United States beyond the Chinese immigrants that are on the West Coast. We'll see a great degree of industrialization, so more railroads, more mining, more factory systems that will be created, increased financial awareness, and the increase of labor unions because of it. We'll see a high concentration of wealth in the upper classes and increased poverty and inequality among the immigrant classes. So you'll see people like the Rockefellers, the Roosevelts, those really big names that come to mind about being really wealthy people. They come out of this period, and granted, most of those people will become known for being philanthropists, but before they're money-making, machine industrializing men. So with the Panic of 1873, this is a financial crisis, and it'll lead to a depression between 1873 and 1879. Now, this one specifically will be caused by inflation from the Civil War. So any kinds of speculations like on railroads or money that's going into the economy that's helping to kind of like bump up prices for things that the army is buying. You know, when the army stops buying them, bam, they're gone, they're out. The demonetization of silver. And this will really come from the gold rush between 1840 and 1910, and German demonetization of silver. So they're taking silver out of being the backing for their currency. And the Coinage Act of 1873 will be the thing that does it for the United States. The United States will demonetize silver. So they'll take it out of the economy as its backing, and they'll use solely gold because they think, oh, gold is so prominent. There's this giant gold rush in the West, and we're going to get all of this gold into the bank for this. Really not that much gold comes in, but you still have gold backing the economy. We'll see a trade deficit. So we're spending more money and sending more things out than, we're getting money back for it, if that makes sense. Economic dislocation from the Franco-Prussian War. So at this point between 1870 and 1871, Prussia and France are in a war, and so we'll be losing money that where we would normally sell and trade with the French. We don't have that anymore because of this Franco-Prussian War. There'll be huge amounts of property damage and property loss in Chicago and in Boston because of fires. Severe bank strain and bank failures will kind of perpetuate this financial crisis that we're talking about here. And then on top of that, to beat all, you'll have the Vienna Stock Exchange crash. So think back to 2008, 2009, when we see the housing bubble just collapse, and we see our stock market just plummet down in our recession over the last couple of years, and how hard we've had to go and we've had to fight to kind of regain our standing with that. So there was this bubble of false expansion, insolvencies, manipulations of the market, and none of these items that are being purchased and these stocks that are being purchased are really truly worth what it's being claimed that they're worth. So this will lead to just a massive amount of bank failures. So moving on from there, this is where we actually get to the stuff where there might be some good things happening, because there are some good things going on between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So we've talked about the direct cause of the Panic and the Depression of 1870, but there will also be increases in productivity that are caused by lower prices. This unfortunately leads to high unemployment. So there are some drawbacks to it, yes, but we'll see tons of improvements in steel, petroleum, automobiles, railroads. So there are some benefits to this too. So in the petroleum industry, which will start in Scotland and be brought to America sometime around 1859 by Edwin Drake, this will lead to kerosene production, and then on to gasoline, which was an unwanted byproduct of kerosene until the advent of cars. There will be an invention of the Bessemer process, which will help reduce impurities in pig iron that's caused by oxidation. So what's happening here, if any of you guys have ever seen Forged in Fire, you'll see as they're pounding on the pieces of metal, you'll see little flakes that kind of fly off. That's part of that removal of impurities. And that's part of the process. But you've also got this blowing of air on top of this metal, and they can just kind of like whack it away, and so you'll have fewer impurities and much stronger iron, and so there'll be an increased scale and rate in the production of steel directly related to the Bessemer process being developed. And so you'll have cheaper railroads. For the railroad industry specifically, iron will be almost completely replaced by steel. And this accelerated rail production because of steel's durability. And the production will also lead to more powerful engines. They can hold more heat, so they can go faster. They can last longer, and this will lead to cheaper shipping. It was at one time said that you could almost completely get rid of most of your working staff on the railroads because they weren't replacing so many railroad ties at this point. So, you might have, prior to this Bessemer process being invented, you might have railroad ties, you might have 700 that need to be replaced in a year. And then post Bessemer process, you'll have maybe one a year that needs to be replaced. And so this will lead to far lower shipping costs because you don't need as many people to keep your railroad going. Bicycles will become a huge fad in the 1890s, and they'll call it the bicycle boom. The first modern roads will develop out of this. Your first automobiles will be driven on these bicycle roads, and the inventor of these it's Carl Benz, but Henry Ford will build his first car in 1896, and this will eventually lead to assembly lines that will be developed to keep costs low because you've kind of got that muscle memory to it. So let's say that you've got a giant line of people, and they're all adding on certain pieces. And you'll have one person who just screws in nuts all day, and they just screw in and continue to do that. And the next person will screw in another bolt over here, and they'll do that all day long. And so you'll get really fast at screwing in screws and bolts and putting pieces together and holding them together while somebody else screws in a piece or a bolt. And so eventually you get really fast at this, and you can just keep going and going and going and going and going. And so it'll just continue through this entire process until you have a fully built car, which is fabulous. And so cost for vehicles will be really low, which is why you'll see a boom in vehicle production based off of steel on bicycle roads. And so they kind of all work together in this. Now, radios and phones, on the other hand, are a little trickier. So you've got wireless radio transmission that will be invented by please forgive me if anybody else is Italian and can say this name better than I can. But it is Guglielmo Marconi. Gosh, I butchered that name. And he'll develop this wireless radio transmission in about 1897. It'll be considered more efficient than telegraph because you don't have to worry about wires or anything like that. And there's no need for underwater wires either. So wireless radio transmission becomes hugely popular. And then you also have the development of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell, which he intended to increase the speed of business transaction. And this will really be seen as the downfall of wire communications. So by wire communications, we don't mean that the phones aren't connected by wire, but we're talking about Morse code. We'll have developments in literature, specifically with Walt Whitman and Mark Twain. Walt Whitman will be called the Bard of Democracy. He'll be born in about 1819, and he'll live somewhere around 1892 in West Hills, New York. He'll be a poet, an essayist, a Civil War nurse, and a journalist. And his most famous work is called Leaves of Grass. And it became an epic poem from in a first-person perspective about your average American person. And he'll just continue to expand this work until he dies, and he'll become famous and rich off of this. Mark Twain follows kind of this similar, like, roundabout way to becoming a great literary person. So he'll live between 1835 and 1810. His real name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, but he'll be a writer, a humorist, an entrepreneur, a publisher, a miner, a riverboat captain, and a lecturer. So he just kind of has all of these odd jobs that he kind of collects. And his most famous pieces will be of normal American kids. So, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He'll start a publishing company with Charles C. Webster, and it will be called Charles C. Webster and Company. And this will help to promote his literature. You also have differences in art. And I'm going to try to, I know I've kept you guys over an hour here, so I'm going to try to wrap this up fairly quickly. But art, you'll have a movement away from Impressionist art, which you can see down in the far left-hand corner, to either a movement toward realism, as you'd see next door in the bottom right. And Thomas Eakins is really best known for being the first realist. Or you'll have a movement toward nostalgia, like these pieces that are up here in the top right. And Winslow Holmes is particularly famous for this. But you've got the Civil War that's over, and you're trying to bring back this memory of peace from before the Civil War, and trying to learn how to cope with these things. And really, this is the primary way in which we see Americans coping with this, is this movement either back to nostalgia or this vision of progressing forward. And so you'll have realism and nostalgia that really become key components to this. Now, popular culture. You'll see just wild things that erupt out of popular culture. And some of them I've shown to you. You know, you have the advent of the daguerreotype camera. So I don't know if you guys can see this or not. This kind of crazy looking woman. But you've got this little book here. It's just a picture of this lady here. And this is what they call a daguerreotype photograph. And this daguerreotype is a, if I can get it out, here we go, a glass plate. You can see right there. And the negative will be burned onto this by slow exposure. So what you'll have is you'll put a glass plate into your camera, and then you'll have a bright flash, and it will burn this image onto the glass plate. And so I don't know if you guys can see it. If I hold up the back, you might be able to see it just a little. You can kind of see the outline of this lady with like her hair right here and her body kind of down in this area. But the image will be burnt on to this plate here, and then they'll just cover it with this foil that's right here. And then they'll put it in these lovely little boxes. And this one here says Holmes, Booth, and Hayden's daguerreotype photographic and ambrotype goods of every description. So you'll have companies that go around and they're just kind of taking pictures of people. And this is these still frames. The reason why people always look so incredibly serious in these pictures is because it's such a slow exposure. You have to sit there stock still for like 4 hours. So if you can't sit there and smile for 4 hours, then you're not going to have a good daguerreotype photograph. So extremely slow exposures. Okay, so on top of this, you'll have vaudeville that becomes popular, and vaudeville is like this circus-like touring group of actors, comedians, trained animals. And they'll just kind of like tour around towns. And they're just completely separate, unrelated acts of entertainment. That's the best way to describe them. Clothes will take on a new form. So blazers will be created for men in the 1890s. Short hair on top with facial hair will start becoming more prominent features, and these will go out of style in the slightly later in the 19th century. And top hats will just boom in the fashion industry for men. Now, for ladies, elaborate hats, like the ones that you see in these pictures here, will become the fashion. And it will actually cause 95% of the shorebirds in the Everglades to be killed for their plumes. And it will nearly cause their extinction all over the Everglades. Dresses and skirts will move from the kind of belle figure that you see in movies like Gone with the Wind and things like that, to more like inverted triangles with jackets a lot of times. And so you can see over here these cage pieces. So you'll go from having like a this shape to a this shape, and then just kind of like a this shape. And then you'll get bigger triangular pieces with big poofy sleeves like the ones that are up here in the top left. But these pieces will become increasingly popular. And it's also the point where you start having things like these become popular. So this is from the late 1800s. And these are actually made out of a substance called French ivy. And you can see French ivy right here. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. But these French ivory pieces are actually old film. They're plastic. Plastic. But plastic will really start coming into fashion. And not only will plastic come into fashion, but bright, vibrant colors will come into fashion. So you'll have less of those organic and homemade dyes and more chemical dyes. So you'll see an eruption of brightly colored dresses. So mauve and like puce green are the two like it colors of the time, which I don't understand why anybody would ever use puce green ever, but they do. Just a couple other pieces out of here, so things that you might not be super familiar with. So this here, your ladies have very dainty shoes with very dainty little buttons and very dainty little buttonholes. So what they would do is they'd have the side of the shoe here, and they'd have this little dainty buttonhole, and so they'd reach this through, they'd grab the button on the other side and pull it through with this piece, which is very cool. Hair washing was not generally considered as important at this time, and in fact, to get those kind of like elaborate curls, you had to have slightly dirty hair, and you would use a brush that's more like this one. See, it's not particularly like rigid, so you're not going to be able to get tangles out with that. For that, you would really use something more like this comb that I'm going to show you guys. Oh, come on, don't break teeth. So like this comb here. And you would get most of your tangles out with this piece. And then after you got your tangles out, you would take this brush, this very soft brush, and you just kind of move the oil down the hair follicle. And then from there, you would go on to style your hair, especially with those kind of like elaborate curls. And these kits like I've got here, have lots and lots of different pieces. This one's a shoe brush, so you're brushing your shoes down, making sure your shoes look good and clean. Nail buffs, which is kind of cool. And then you'll just have other little miscellaneous holders and pieces that will help you keep yourself nice and trim. You know, a nail file, of course. Every lady needs a good nail file. And so these pieces will really start showing up about this time. You'll also have these. And these are really stinking cool. This is called a stereo viewer. And essentially what would happen is you would take one of these cards. Let me get one that's got a good picture, a good vibrant picture. They start out, you know, fairly simple, little homey pictures. And then they'll duplicate it on both sides. It'll be the exact same picture. There's no tricks or anything there. And they pop them into this holder here, right here. And then they put them up to their eyes, and then they move them out until the picture came into focus. And then once the picture came into focus, you'd have a 3D image of whatever was on the picture. So it was completely adjustable. So if you're nearsighted, you could move it closer. If you're farsighted, you can move it a little farther out. Or if you have perfect vision, it ends up sitting about right here in the middle. So you've got this lovely 3D image of whatever's on this picture. And these will start being printed based off of your daguerreotype photos, which is very cool. You'll also start having your first moving kind of pictures here. They're all silent, but you'll start seeing them. So from here, the last thing that we have to cover is just suffrage. And I'm going to try to get through suffrage pretty quick because we'll cover suffrage more, I believe, later in the semester. So, very, very quickly. So you've got a couple of really prominent figures in the suffrage movement. And suffrage simply means just the right to vote. So, because we're in the KCTCS system, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of our Kentucky ladies, and then we'll go on from there. So, Laura Clay, who is the daughter of Marcus Cassius Clay, Bowie knife man, will be the co-founder and the first president of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. She'll be a leader in the women's suffrage movement and active in the Democratic Party at all levels. She'll be the first woman to be nominated for president at the convention of a major political party also. And overall, she saw it as her job to lobby for legislative reforms, such as protecting women's wages. So if women were employed and they became married, a lot of times their employer would drop their wages. She also wanted to protect women's property. She wanted to reform the state of women's health and women's mental hospitals and mental health hospitals to have female doctors. And she also lobbied for the admissions of female students into Kentucky universities. Your first female dorms will show up in Kentucky universities because of her. You'll have the increased age of female marriage consent, which sounds a little counterproductive, but at the same time, when you've got girls who are getting married at 13, you know, moving it up to a little older is not that big of a step. You'll see the creation of juvenile courts, and she will be active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So moving on from here, nationally, we'll have two big names. Probably the most famous is Susan B. Anthony, but you'll also have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are the two ladies who are on the far left. Laura Clay is the one who's on the right, who looks like she's got antenna like sticking out of her head. But Susan B. Anthony will be part of the women's rights movement. And she'll see it as part of a greater social reform movement. She was an abolitionist. She will be committed completely to social equality. The Susan B. Anthony Amendment in 1920 will become the 19th Amendment, which they'll fashion after the 14th Amendment. And it will be backed by the California Republican Senator Aaron Sargent. And we'll see that this comes out of an argument that the 14th Amendment covers women too, in the court case Manor versus Happersett. but we won't actually have that come about. So they'll have to take it and pass a whole new amendment. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a little different. She and Susan B. Anthony, they knew each other, they're friends. She's most famous for her Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. She was part of the temperance movement, so the movement to limit alcohol. She was an abolitionist. She was a friend of Susan B. Anthony's, and she would be a huge influence on the women's rights movement along with Susan B. Anthony. And she's really the initiator of the women's rights movement with the Declaration of Sentiments. She didn't support the 14th Amendment because it lacked the clause that gave women's rights that Susan B. Anthony fought so hard with Minor and Happersett to get that passed as, women having rights. She didn't, Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't support it because it didn't give women those rights. The 19th Amendment will be passed, and it will say, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state based on account of sex." So women will eventually gain the right to vote with this, but it won't come until a little bit later in the 20th century. So with that, I will wrap up this video. I also want to point out to you guys, just as an aside, that your first test is in 2 weeks. So what I want you guys to do is start highlighting your people, your places, and your terms, and start studying now. These tests are not easy, but they're much easier when you have a chance to study them. So look over them prior to test date, so that way on the day that you're taking the test, you're not sitting there going, "Oh my gosh, where are my notes? Is this?" I prefer for them not to be open book, but I can't stop you from making them open book, so I will leave that on your honor if you want to make that open book or not, but I'd prefer you didn't. So with that, I'd also like to point out that some of you guys had some incredibly cool primary sources. So my daughter right now has been learning about the Civil War and about a little bit about the Civil Rights Movement, I believe. And she learned about oh gosh, I can't remember her name now. But she was learning about the a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and seeing some of those pieces from the Underground Railroad, they were very, very cool to her. So I have to thank you for those, and I must admit that while my daughter didn't see your names, she did see some of your primary source document analysis pieces, which were really stinking cool, by the way. I think I don't remember if I saw a gold doubloon on this one or not, but I did see some very cool other ones. I want to make sure that you guys understand that your primary source document analysis is on this lecture that I'm posting on the video here, or if I post associated videos along with this lecture, you can do it off of those too. But it is not on the book. Only your summary and assessment is done on the book. Okay, what I've done, since I didn't get around to grading the first set very quickly for those pieces, and to kind of say thank you for your patience up to this point with my horrible technological issues, I have given you guys full credit for all of your pieces that are turned in by midnight tonight. So if you did them, you get full credit for all pieces that you've turned in by midnight tonight. So, good job. Well done for those of you guys who have turned these things in. Let me know if you have any questions about anything that we've covered here tonight. And in that case, have a good night. So, I'll see you guys next week. Bye!